Welcome back to Terms of Service. I'm CNN tech reporter Clare Duffy. If I asked you what one company has had the biggest impact on personal technology, on the gadgets we use, the services available on those devices, the culture around tech, what would you say? Maybe Apple? Apple revolutionized personal computers, phones, and more. And as today's guest, David Pogue, writes in his new book, 27% of the world's population now uses Apple products. That means if Apple users were a country, it would be the most populous in the world. As the company turns 50 years old this year, I wanted to take a look back at how Apple came to have such a huge influence in all of our lives. So I invited David Pogue into the studio. David is a CBS Sunday Morning correspondent and best-selling author whose new book, Apple, The First 50 Years, paints a detailed picture of that history. My conversation with David coming right up. Before we really get into the book, you have been writing about Apple for over 20 years now. You were actually in college when the first Macintosh came out. What was it like for you when you first experienced Apple's technology?
That was really my introduction to technology. I'm known now as a tech reporter, but I was like a musical theater nerd in high school. I had no clue. But this thing was so beautiful and so powerful. I mean, many of your viewers are too young to remember, but in 1984, computers were command line. You would memorize commands, you'd have to type them with punctuation. And
they may or may not have had a screen, right?
That is true, yeah. Computers until the Apple I and Apple II did not even have screens or keyboards. You used flippy switches and little lights to read the output. But the Macintosh was completely different. It was the graphic interface. It was the first time the masses had a mouse and menus, so you didn't have to remember the commands, and windows that overlapped and you could copy and paste, and little icons that represented your piece of paper. I mean, everything people know now, but at the time it was revolutionary and opened up using computers to vast new realms of people.
For people who might not realize the full picture, just give us an overview of how influential and powerful Apple is now. How do you quantify it?
Well, until AI came along, it was the most valuable company in the world in terms of its total stock price. They sell 220 million phones a year. They make $1 million every 90 seconds.
That was a wild stat from the book.
Well, we've been sitting here. Steve Jobs revolutionized the marketing of technology, the design of technology, the simplification, and also Apple didn't invent the CD drive, the DVD burner, Wi-Fi, the touchscreen phone, the tablet. All of those things came before, the laser printer, the personal network. But Apple introduced them all. So Jobs' thing was being able to spot fledgling new technologies that were really cool but really complicated and not there for everyday consumer use, and simplifying them and beautifying them enough that they could release it to everybody.
Right. Apple products obviously are so popular. Could you talk a little bit about why you think it's important for folks, for users, to look back at the history of this company?
Yeah. First of all, to understand how Apple got where it is, it helps to understand its culture. And to know its culture, you have to look back to where that came from. And it came from these two dudes, the two Steves, Wozniak and Jobs, who met. Woz was in college and Jobs was in high school, 4 years behind him. And they both had similar outlooks in terms of they wanted technology no longer to be the realm of governments and corporations and computer nerds. They wanted it to be an appliance for everybody, which was a weird thought in the 70s. I mean, computers, the best thing you could get was a mini computer, which is the size of a microwave oven, and again, no screen, no keyboard. And these guys insisted that someday everyone would have a personal computer. And this was absurd.
I thought it was really interesting. You talk about the two Steves, Steve Jobs, Steve Wozniak. Most people, I think, associate Apple with the iconic founder, Steve Jobs. Love you, Woz. But you actually start the book with the story of Steve Wozniak. Why?
Well, because the story began with Steve Wozniak. So Woz was a member of this local computer club in what we now call Silicon Valley, the Homebrew Computer Club, where all these nerds would go, and they had this post-60s us against them passion to bring computing to the masses. And of course, that was Woz's thought from the very beginning. He made what we now know as the Apple I. They only sold 175 of them. No one remembers it. It wasn't even in a case. It was just a circuit board for hobbyists. But from the beginning, Woz created the technology and Jobs wanted to sell it. So that was their deal. Jobs wasn't entirely non-technical. He was into electronics, but nothing like Woz, who was just a savant with circuitry. So the Apple I and then the Apple II, which of course was the computer that introduced the public to home computing. I mean, that thing sustained Apple for 10 years while they experimented with a bunch of failed machines. So really, Woz was the backbone of Apple's first 10 years.
Now, on to the other Steve. You make the point in the book that much of what Apple is, what it has been, can be traced back to Steve Jobs. What was he like, and how did that influence Apple's culture?
Jobs is depicted often as this raging tyrant who would just rip you apart if he didn't like your work. He was said to be cruel. I think what all that misses is that there were really 3 Steve Jobses. So there was a Steve 0.0, as Woz calls it, when he was in high school and he teamed up with Woz, and they were friends. They were best friends. They'd talk about girls and music and technology and culture. Then Jobs, very early 20s, very young, was thrust into the position of being a multimillionaire, running this gigantic corporation, never finished college, never had any training in managing or working with people. And then he got kicked out of Apple in 1985, in part because of his temper and his intolerance. He was gone for years, and then in 1996, Apple brought him back to the company. And this they call Steve 2.0. He had started Pixar. He had started Next. He had more experience in companies and working with people, and he was a much more evenly balanced human being when he came back.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, just sort of broadly, it's sort of rare to see the founder of a tech company remain the CEO of the tech company as it matures, probably in part because of this thing. Like when you're 20 and you're starting a company, you don't know how to run a multi-billion-dollar company.
You're right, and it's even weirder. If you think about it, Apple, even as it became a many billion-dollar company, existed primarily to execute the ideas of Steve Jobs. Like the products, they may not have come from his brain, but he was the decider of what product would be and what it would look like. I mean, he would spend hours, weeks, months designing the iTunes music store with his designers, him personally. Like you would not see, the CEO of Microsoft going into the labs where they're deciding where to put the close button on a window. I interviewed Eddie Q, who's the head of services at Apple, and he was responsible for the first Apple online store and the iTunes music store. And he said, if there's ever an autobiography I do, it's going to be called Off by 1 Pixel. Because that was his life with Jobs, the maniac for detail.
Yeah, I mean, part of that, the simplicity, the sleek style, the focus, relentless focus on user interface and user experience has become so central to Apple's brand. That's primarily because of Jobs? That's what he really cared about?
When he died, he told Tim Cook, his successor, don't go through life asking what would Steve do. Don't do that. That's what killed Disney when Walt Disney died. Just say, what is the right thing to do? That's an often quoted passage, but in truth, what would Steve do is everywhere at Apple. He still haunts the place. I asked every one of these interview subjects, what's the through line, if any? What of Apple is still there after 50 years that has never changed? And they all say, it's what Steve created. Simplicity, focus, beauty, and care about even things you won't see. I mean, Jobs would make them rip apart and redesign a circuit board. You'd be like, Steve, no one's going to see the frickin' circuit board. It's inside the machine. He goes, it doesn't matter. What I've told me is you feel care in the design, even if you don't see it.
Apple, we were talking about this before we got started. Apple has survived some really serious, uncertain periods. What has kept the company going?
It almost didn't keep going.
Yeah.
This period of 11 years when there was no jobs there. And you can just literally see the company tipping into chaos and despair and losing money. And they had 3 CEOs in that period. Mm-hmm. At the lowest point, they were 6 weeks from bankruptcy. Apple, one of the most recognized logos, beloved companies in the world with millions of fans, 6 weeks from closing their doors. I mean, it's just unbelievable. In the end, of course, in 1996, Gil Amelio, the much derided last CEO before Jobs came back, desperate for a modern operating system for the Mac, bought Jobs' company Next and brought 300 great engineers and Steve Jobs back to Apple. And the first thing Jobs, this is got, I mean, no matter what you think of Apple, you got to admit this is the greatest business turnaround in history. He fired the entire board. Apple at the time had 70 products. He shut all 70 down. Mm-hmm. He said, we're going to have 4 products, 2 laptops, high-end, low-end, 2 desktops. That's it. He changed the whole corporate structure. And in 1 year, they went from losing money hand over fist at the hands of this guy with no business experience or training to a profitable company. Unbelievable. This one guy, I mean, he nearly killed himself doing it. He didn't sleep. He was running Pixar at the same time, mm-hmm. 2 companies. But yeah, so it's an unbelievable turnaround story.
I wanted to ask how Apple has stayed ahead of the curve on innovation. It is known as such an innovative company, but you also made the interesting point that Apple isn't necessarily always the one coming up with the next product, but they are the one figuring out how to make it friendly to consumers.
Yeah, Apple doesn't really invent a lot of new technologies. The history is them spotting something with promise and making it usable. They also don't buy big brand name companies. You know how like Facebook bought WhatsApp, they bought Instagram for billions of dollars. Apple doesn't do that. It makes small targeted acquisitions of tiny companies you've never heard of, not consumer companies, but companies working on cool technologies. And that way they can add them more smoothly into their corporate culture. They avoid scrutiny by the SEC. So they have a bunch of techniques that have allowed them to sort of keep out ahead, things that other companies don't do.
You were one of the first people to try an iPhone for the first time. What was that experience like? And are you still an Apple user?
I'm still an Apple user. I should point out that this book was not authorized or looked over by Apple. Mm-hmm. It is entirely my own, and it does get into some of the ouchier parts of Apple's history, how they missed AI in the last couple of years. But I'll tell this story even though it makes me look really bad. Apple in 2007 handed out 4 iPhones to the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Newsweek, and USA Today. I was the tech columnist for the New York Times. So I got one of these holy pre-release iPhones. The whole world was losing its mind. They were calling it the Jesus phone. They could not wait till it came out. And I lost it.
Really? How quickly?
Like really quickly. I had a talk to give in Italy, and I took a red eye. And the first iPhone, the back of it was this rounded plastic capsule-like thing. And so on the cab to my speaking engagement from the airport, I kind of slumped back, and it literally slid out of my pocket in the cab. And so I got to the event, and I'm like, I have something to show you. No! Like, mercifully, I had the receipt from the cab, so we knew which cab number it was. And in Italian, they called the guy back, and he was really furious, but he gave it back. He had no idea what it was.
Yeah.
He thought it was a pager or something.
That's so funny. Yeah, imagine if he had known.
Imagine if I never got it back.
Oh, man. That's amazing.
Yeah, so that was fun.
For a company that has such mythology around it, are there parts of the myths that you think that you feel like you confirmed with this book, or were there myths you busted in the process of this reporting? Oh,
man, there are so many myths surrounding Apple. The story of Steve Jobs, the tyrant in an elevator saying, "What do you do here?" And you tell him, he says, "You're fired." Never happened. No one has ever seen that. There's a great story when they were developing the iPod. Jobs wanted it to be as small as it could be, the smallest music player with a hard drive. And so they bring him a prototype, and they're like, this is it, Steve. We've gotten rid of all the extra space. He's like, oh, yeah? And he tosses it into a fish tank in the room, and bubbles come out as it sinks. And he's like, see those air bubbles? That's proof that there's more room in there. Make it smaller.
Wow.
Great story. Never
happened.
Just so many things like that people just, they're great stories, but they got them wrong.
Were there just surprising new discoveries that you made in the process of this reporting, although you've been covering the company for so long?
Oh, yeah. I mean, for some reason, Apple, despite not having any veto power over what's in the book, they did allow me to interview current executives, designers, and engineers, which is a super big deal. They ordinarily do not let current employees speak to press. And they told me some just amazing, outlandish stories about the extremes this company goes to. I mean, like when they were trying to get Face ID to work on the iPhone, they wanted to make sure it would work on every face in the world. So they took it to tribal South American villages where facial structures are different. They took it to twins conferences. They wanted to make sure that it would work no matter what your facial hair. So they would go to Harley Davidson motorcycle rallies where all these guys had weird facial hair to make sure that it would work. They hired Hollywood special effects artists to ship them a box of perfectly formed latex human faces. Fake. Can you imagine being the mailroom guy? Yeah. Oh my God! But they wanted to make sure that you couldn't fool it with a mask. Mm-hmm. I mean, really creepy faces. So, I mean, yeah, the inside stories of how these things were developed are pretty crazy.
Apple has had such a huge impact on how we all communicate and just sort of the way that we relate to one another. Did Apple, at the start, when the Steves were getting this off the ground, did they know they were going to change the world?
No, absolutely not, especially not with the phone. I mean, they all thought they had something really cool, but they could not foresee, changing the world. And that's in part because the first iPhone did not have an app store. Mm-hmm. You got 16 apps and you were happy. Jobs kept saying, as he had his whole career, closed systems are more controllable. They make a more elegant user experience. We don't want people doing cruddy apps, porn apps, criminal apps. So we would have to really control this app thing if we decide to do it. A year later, they did open it up to apps, and that's when everything changed. That was the birth of Uber and Grubhub and Lyft and Tinder and Airbnb.
Social media in a large way.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that was the dawn of the app culture we use now. And that's when it really took off like crazy.
It's such a huge responsibility for a company to have such a significant user base and all of those users' personal information. How has Apple handled that responsibility?
The privacy thing kind of fell into Apple's lap because Google and Facebook, their business is selling ads. Mm-hmm. So they have to collect data about you in order to target you with the right kinds of ads. Apple makes much out of how private it keeps your data. I mean, partly because it's well-meaning, but partly because they don't sell ads. It's not their business. They sell hardware. So they can get away with keeping everything on the phone and not transmitting. So in large part, Apple has avoided the real negativity of big tech companies. They wanted to get into AI, of course, but you can't do AI-level computations on a phone. You have to send it off to much bigger servers, data centers somewhere, right? So how is Apple going to do that while still keeping your data 100% protected? So they invented this new server architecture where your data goes to the server, it's processed, it answers your question, sends it back to you, and then immediately erases the data. And you're like, yeah, sure it does. How do we know? And they're like, okay, we'll tell you what we'll do. We will let anyone, any researcher, any competitor, come and inspect the code on these servers to make sure we're not lying. It's pretty extreme and pretty radical.
You bring up AI. It feels like Apple is in sort of a different moment right now than it has been for a lot of its history. The platform that they said was going to be the future of computing. Their Vision Pro headset has kind of flopped. They're seen as being behind in AI. Do you think that Apple is losing its edge?
I mean, definitely Apple does not have the same pattern of hardware successes that they had when Jobs was there. I mean, iMac, iPod, iPad, iPhone, iTunes Music Store, that was roughly every 3 years. Apple would come out with another mega hardware hit. Since Tim Cook took over, the only successes have been the Apple Watch and AirPods. And they're big successes, but they're not platforms in the way the phone was or the tablet was. So there's two ways of thinking about this. One is that Apple has lost its hardware mojo. They don't have Steve Jobs anymore. They can't do it anymore. Tim Cook has admitted, I'm not a product guy. That's not my job. I pick the best designers and engineers, and they do it. But the other alternative viewpoint is no one else has come up with a platform like those either. No other company. Maybe the low-hanging fruit of the 90s and the early 2000s have been plucked. Maybe even Steve Jobs couldn't come up with another mega hit of that size. We don't know. What we do know is that Tim Cook has taken the company much more into software and services. You know, the Apple Music is now bigger than Spotify. They make so much money with these services. And eventually AI, they're trying. They completely missed the AI wave, the generative AI wave. They demonstrated some amazing stuff, you know, in 2024, like a new Siri that had access to your email and your messages and stuff. So you could say, what time do I need to leave to pick up my mom? And it would go through your email, know that your mom is flying in today, then in the background go to a flight tracking website and look up the flight, then look at Google Maps and know what the traffic's like. And in the blink of an eye say, you need to leave at 1:20. Like that would be genuinely useful. I would like that.
If they could pull it off, which they have not yet.
Which they have not.
If you could get Apple to bring back one retired product, what would it be?
One retired product. You know, a lot of people, iPhones have gotten really big. And for a long time, they offered, you know, the SE, they offered a smaller one for people with smaller hands. And it didn't sell as well as they'd like. So that's kind of gone away. But I know a lot of people, including my wife, who really find the big phones too big. So I think they should still offer a smaller iPhone.
Okay, I love it. I love that you told the fish tank story because actually for me, it's the iPod Shuffle. I miss my iPod Shuffle. I want to be able to take a tiny thing that does one job to the gym. That's my pick. Are there any lessons from Apple or its leadership that you've incorporated into your own life?
Into my own life. I think that idea, I mean, let me be clear. Apple is a really exacting place to work. I mean, a lot of people burn out. A lot of people say it's way too controlling, way too locked down. But they will all admit that this company stops at nothing to make its product a success. I mean, I gave you some of those examples. And there have been times working on this book or a CBS Sunday Morning Story or whatever, when all right, that's pretty good. Is it as good as it could possibly get? If I did another pass through this script, could it get better? And I guess the lessons of that degree of extremism translating into success, it's a hard lesson to ignore. And almost anything, I go through life now with my poor wife. You know, some interface will be badly designed. And I keep saying to my wife, whatever happened to excellence? Whatever happened to everybody wanting to do the best job they could do? You know, software design and airline websites and designs of door handles and locks.
Yeah. I mean, it is such an interesting point because it does feel like so much of technology now is tech for the sake of having tech because we can do things. And Apple does feel like an exception where they've always thought about where are we really adding value for customers.
It's really counterintuitive. Steve Jobs' thing was always, it's not knowing what features to put in. It's knowing what features to take out.
Well, David, thank you so much for sharing and congratulations. I hope all of our listeners will go and buy and read your excellent book. It really is worth reading. So thank you.
Thank you very much. You have excellent taste.